king to see, pa-rum-pum-pum-pum. Our finest gifts we bring, pa-rum-pum-pum-pum, to lay before the king, pa-rum-pum-pum-pum, rum-pum-pum-pum, rum-pum-pum-pum. And so to honor him, pa-rum-pum-pum-pum, when we come, when we come, when we come. في نجمي ضوت في السما من بعيد، هالنجمي كانت من ملاك الروح، ولد المسيح بارم سبحوه يا جميع الناس، هللو هللو.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're glad to see you all here this evening for the Center and Library for the Bible and Social Justice's Scholar Activist Encounter series. And we just had a beautiful opening song from a group of singers from Bethlehem in the occupied territory of Palestine, in Palestine. This is fitting to start with this beautiful song tonight, both because it's Advent, and we're so glad that you're taking time to join with us during Advent, and also because we're going to be talking about peace building. This evening's session is co-sponsored by the Christian Peacemakers Team International and also by the Network for Biblical Storytellers International. And we're going to be dialoguing with Tom Boomershine and Weldon Nisly, who have both been engaged in scholarship and ministry and activism around peace building internationally for many decades, and Weldon especially in the occupied territories in Palestine, and also in the Kurdish regions in Iraq. And so it's going to be wonderful to hear from both of them. My name is Amy Dalton. I'm with the Center and Library for the Bible and Social Justice, as I mentioned before. I also wanted to just take a moment before we jump into this tonight to acknowledge the caretakers of the lands that our Center and Library are on. For hundreds of thousands of years before CLBSJ is located currently, the land where we are was inhabited by Munsee and Lenape people. Those included Ramapo Lenape, which is a tribe that still is here in the region, as well as Tapan, Rumanshanek, and the Nyack peoples. Because the river that we currently call the Hudson River is very near to where we're at, the area was an area where many peoples met and traded and lived in relationship with one another. So we feel very blessed to do our work within this living history, and we commit to ongoing solidarity with the people indigenous to this land. And I see that some people, as is a nice, really wonderful practice, if you feel like you want to say hi in the chat and say where you're located and what indigenous people are connected to the land where you are, that would be wonderful, a wonderful practice that I invite you into. And I'm also going to invite my colleague, Nick Johnson, who's the chair of the board of the Center and Library for the Bible and Social Justice, to give us a word of prayer as an opening. Nick, thank you.
Thank you, Amy, and good evening, everyone. Again, I am Nick Johnson, President and Board Chair for the Center and Library for the Bible and Social Justice. We welcome you to this next series in our Scholar Activist Encounter series this evening. And I am sure that Weldon and Tom have a very enriching and wonderful conversation planned for us, and I look forward to our fellowship this evening. And so I want to open us up this evening by remembering a friend of CLBSJ. He is a founding member and former president, Jack Elliott. He transitioned last week to eternal rest unexpectedly, and we honor him this evening and we remember him for his wonderful work, both in biblical studies as a New Testament scholar. Many of you may know of his work on First Peter, um, a fundamental text, A Home for the Homeless, that studies First Peter. He completed an exhaustive multi-volume series on the evil eye, um, uh, with in partnership with CLBSJ, and he was fundamental in many justice movements in the San Francisco Bay Area. So he will be sorely missed by many of us in the CLBSJ community, those at Stony Point, and the world of biblical studies mourns his loss. And we hope that you will keep his family and his loved ones in prayer. So we honor him this evening and we remember him and dedicate this Scholar Activist series encounter to him. We also want to thank the Christian Peacemaker teams and the Network of Biblical Storytellers International for their partnership this evening. By way of prayer, I hope that you would indulge me in a reading from the Gospel of Matthew um, as we honor Jack. Again, he completed a wonderful multi-volume monograph series on the evil eye. And I would like to read a wonderful passage from Matthew 20. In fact, it's a parable of Jesus, where Jesus invokes um, this phrase, the evil eye. And so indulge me if you will, because I'll be reading from the King James Version because it actually uses the evil eye phrase. But listen as we hear the words of Jesus. So this is Matthew 20. For the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is an house owner, which went out early in the morning to hire laborers in the vineyard. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them in his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and said unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right I will give you. And they went their way. Again he went out about the sixth hour and the ninth hour, and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle, and saith unto them, Why stand ye here all day idle? They say unto him, Because no man hath hired us. He saith unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right, that shall ye receive. So when eve was come, the Lord of the vineyard saith unto his steward, Call the laborers, and give them their hire, beginning from the last unto the first. And when they came that were hired about the 11th hour, they received every man a penny. But when the first came, they supposed that they should have received more, and they likewise received every man a penny. And when they had received it, they murmured against the good man of the house, saying, These last have wrought but 1 hour, and thou hast made them equal unto us, which have borne the burden and the heat of the day. But he answered one of them and said, Friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst thou not agree for me a penny? Take that thine is, and go thy way. I will give unto this last even as unto thee. Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with mine own? Is thine eye evil because I am good? So the last shall be first, and the first last, for many be called, but few chosen. These words for the people of God. Now I'll turn it back to Amy, who will introduce our conversants for the evening.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. And yes, we're actually, Tom and Weldon are going to do the majority of their own introduction, but I will just say a couple of logistical notes first. I will just say, first of all, this is the first time that we've at CLBSJ used a webinar function. So we've been used to being able to like say hi to everybody. And well, you can see us, but we can't see you. So we trust that you're there, and just wanted to note that change in our common practice, and just, you know, say we're still trying to be as present as when we had the low grade version. And we're especially grateful to Christian Peacemakers team for allowing us to use the webinar function, which allows us to have more people on this wonderful call. There's also another thing that goes along with the webinar version of the Zoom, is that you can put your questions in this thing called the question and answer box. So you should be able to see it kind of along the bottom of your screen. And you can also put them in the chat if you can't find it, but if you can find the question and answer box, that'll just help us be able to more easily see your questions. And it would be really wonderful if people could put any questions that occur to them as the conversation unfolds. So first we're gonna, Weldon and Tom are gonna introduce themselves. They have a long working relationship, and so they're the best to, you know, tell you about each other. And then they're both gonna give a presentation and dialogue with each other, and then we'll have time for audience questions. So that's the game plan, folks. And with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Tom.
Good evening, everyone. I am honored and delighted to introduce to you Weldon Nisly, with whom I've been friends since, 1986. Weldon is a lifelong Mennonite pastor who was pastor of the Cincinnati Mennonite Church for 11 years, and then the Mennonite Church in Seattle for 19. Since his retirement from the active parish, he's been a committed member of Christian Peacemaker teams, and has spent approximately half a year each year in either Palestine or Kurdistan. And he's also a lifelong member of the Network of Biblical Storytellers, at least as long as the network has been in existence, which is right around 1977 when that began. So it's a great honor to introduce Weldon, and I look forward to this dialogue with him.
Thank you, Tom. It's an equal honor to introduce you, and welcome to all of you who are on. I long for the day when we can all be in the same room and talking together about these important matters. Tom Boomershine was a longtime New Testament professor at United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio, in the US. Earlier in life, when Tom was studying at Union Seminary in New York, he was the coordinator for the Student Interracial Ministry in 1964 during the Civil Rights Movement. So Tom has also been a lifelong activist scholar. By the way, it's notable that Network of Biblical Storytellers and CPT both began in the mid-'80s, about roughly the same time. Tom is founder of the Network of Biblical Storytellers and of Go Tell Communications, the latter along with his marriage partner, Amelia. Tom is I call him a pastor, preacher, pianist, and biblical storyteller par excellence. I first heard of Tom in 1985 when a friend told me that this guy named Tom Boomershine was planning a biblical storytelling event on telling stories of peace. Sadly, I was unable to attend that event, but did participate in one a year later, 1986. And there, Tom shared a vision for telling biblical stories with people considered to be our enemies. For example, in the Soviet Union, this was still the Cold War. I heard Tom's vision as a call to me. So we talked about it, and 2 months later, in August of 1986, we sat in a McDonald's in Dayton and envisioned a biblical storytelling journey to the Soviet Union exactly 2 years later, in August of '88. That's another whole story. But Tom's two defining books are Story Journey, An Invitation to the Gospel as Storytelling, and The Messiah of Peace, a performance criticism commentary on Mark's Passion Resurrection. Tom, I am honored to share this time with you. Tell us about Jesus, the Messiah of Peace in first century Palestine.
Well, my work as a scholar has been focused on exploring the implications of what has become clear about the Gospels, that they were compositions that were performed for audiences rather than texts read by readers, and that was because 90 to 95% of the people in the ancient world were illiterate. And so the way in which they experienced things was by hearing them be performed. So what has emerged from that is a very different picture of Mark and of Jesus as the Messiah of Peace. So this is a quick summary of major implications of that work, of seeking to understand the stories of Mark, Matthew, Luke, John in their original context. So, so the setting of Mark's story, what emerges from listening and telling Mark's story is that it was addressed to Israelites in the immediate aftermath of the Jewish-Roman War, which was from 66 to 70 CE. And this story was then addressed to people who were seeking a way forward in the aftermath of the greatest tragedy in the entire history of Israel. The leveling of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the murder, the slaughtering of between 1.5 million and 2 million people, both during and in the aftermath of the war. This experience was in the aftermath of the expectations in Israel of a Messiah. So the messianic expectation in Israel was focused on a warrior king who would bring back power to Israel. And the classic story was the story of David and Goliath, which is probably, after the birth narrative of Jesus, the most frequently told story from the Bible. What it reflects is a myth that was present then and now, the myth of redemptive violence. That myth, simply put, is the belief that the way in which the human community or the nation will be delivered from captivity, from oppression by the powers of evil, is by violence. And that the way of violence is the way of redemption. And so this is reflected in the traditions of Israel, in that the warrior kings of Israel were called messiahs. In the Septuagint, the word Christ is used for each of those kings who was ordained, anointed as king. So it is against that background that the story of Jesus was told, as a story of the Messiah of peace. And what I want to summarize are the structures of Jesus doing good for the enemies of Israel as his characteristic action. So Jesus was then, from the very beginning of the story, announced as a nonviolent Messiah, as one who would operate by the power of the Holy Spirit. And the most striking thing about Jesus as Messiah against the background of the myth of redemptive violence is that he was wholly nonviolent. But he also extended his nonviolent interventions to the enemies of Israel. And so from early on in the story, Jesus does good for Israelites, but he also does good for the enemy. The first journey is into the territory of the nations, the region of the Gerasenes, where there was a demoniac who was possessed by a legion of demons. And just in case there's any ambiguity about the Romans being embodying the powers of evil, the demons are named legion, and they are driven out by being driven out by Jesus into swine, and that they rushed down the hill and were drowned in the sea, which clearly reflects the culture of ancient Israel. The next journey was Jesus doing good for the enemy to the north. In Gentile territory in Tyre, Sidon, and the Decapolis, what are now Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. So in those surrounding territories, Jesus journeyed to do good for his enemies. The first was a Syrophoenician woman whose daughter was possessed by a demon. And she very aggressively asked him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he initially refused. She persisted, and he cast the demon out of her daughter. A revolutionary action in the context of the expectations of a Messiah of Israel. The next was that he healed a deaf and mute man. And after healing him, the people were, and these were then Gentiles, they were overwhelmed with joy at what he had done. And then he fed 4,000 Gentiles in the wilderness, just as he had fed 5,000 Israelites, Jews on the other side of the sea. And so the Sea of Galilee and these boundaries were then what separated the people of Israel from the others, from the nations on the other side. The next journey was his trip to first Bethsaida and then to the area of near Bethsaida, near Caesarea Philippi. And the Messianic confession, the first identification, explicit identification is by someone else, namely Peter, as the Messiah, takes place surrounded by then these stories of Jesus' action in the countries of the Gentiles. The next major description of Jesus is that he cast out the demon from this demon-possessed boy, and that was the climax of his healing and exorcism ministry, which was extended then to his enemies. The next part of the climactic part of the gospel is Jesus in Jerusalem. At the core of the actions that led to his execution was Jesus' nonviolent demonstration in the temple, which was a demonstration for a place of prayer for all the nations. As he said, "Is it not written in the book of Jeremiah, my house shall be called a house of prayer among all the nations, but you have made it a den of laysdays, of insurrectionists." This demonstration for the temple as a place of prayer for all the nations, where Jews and Gentiles could together, was then Jesus' revolutionary action that led to the organization of the plot to kill him. Another indication of Jesus' commitment to this ministry to those on the other side was at the Passover meal, where he announced over the wine, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." And so the Israelites who heard that would have heard this in contrast to the original covenant, which was for Israel. So this is an expansion then of the promise of the new covenant. After his arrest and his nonviolent resistance to arrest, but not asking his disciples to attack, the disciples run away. After his confession, Peter denies him. So the issue of affiliation with a Messiah who is nonviolent becomes a major issue in these stories. The climax of that is that the people are given the choice at the Pilate trial of whether to choose Barabbas, an insurrectionist, or Jesus. And they choose the insurrection. In the context of Mark's audience in the aftermath of the war, this is a clear allusion to the decision of the people of Israel to rely on warfare as their way of liberation. So the implications of Mark's story. One of the things that's striking about this is that there is a complete absence of Jesus died for my sins, which has become the kind of characteristic description of the significance of Jesus' death. Rather, Jesus is portrayed in Mark's gospel and in Luke and Matthew as well as a nonviolent Messiah who died for our sins, our communal sins of hatred and violence toward one another as human beings. So the implications of this strategies for peacemaking. First is that Jesus travels to the other side. He travels to the regions of his enemies and does good there. A second is an implication of love of and praying for the enemy. And so his demonstration in the temple is for the sake of this place of prayer. A third is doing good for the enemy. What Jesus does is to model in symbolic actions the power of doing good for those who were on the other side of the ethnic and international conflicts that were present. And finally, a strategy for peacemaking was that Jesus sought to establish a place of prayer for the nations as well as for Israelites, a place where they could pray together. The implications is that these are indications of strategies for peacemaking that have largely been ignored, both in the history of Christianity and not taken seriously. So this story then is a story that gives the lie to the myth of redemptive violence and announces that Jesus is a Messiah who saves by the extension of love and mercy to his enemies. So that would be a summary of then the Messiah of peace. So, Weldon.
Thank you, Tom. That is a good and deep summary. Thank you so much. I need to get on my share screen here yet. And okay. I hope you can all see that. From Jesus in the first century, am I, Tom's on, is everyone? Stop sharing your screen sharing. Can you hear me? Tom, I can.
Yes, yep, I hear you.
You can see the.
I'm not seeing your PowerPoint yet.
Oh, you're not?
No, what's up is the Scholar Activist webinar.
Okay, let me stop and, okay. Here. I thought it shared from the
Here we
get-go,
are.
but I'm not seeing where.
This is your first screen.
Yeah, well, then that looked great. Your first screen was what we were looking at that said Scholar Activist webinar.
Right.
Yeah, that you're seeing there, but
That's your first screen. Sorry.
okay. Jesus in the first century, we leap to 21st century Middle East. After 4 decades of Mennonite peace and pastoral ministry, I am now a member of Christian Peacemaker teams, CPT, as I'll say throughout, CPT. I've been serving on the CPT, Iraqi Kurdistan and Palestine teams. I will introduce CPT, then introduce you to amazing Palestinian and Kurdish people. CPT builds partnerships to transform violence and oppression in conflict situations by accompanying, advocating with, and amplifying voices of local people. CPT supports nonviolent actions of our partners who risk their lives to confront oppression. Founded in the mid-1980s by historic peace churches, CPT quickly became ecumenical and is now a multi-faith peace-building effort with teams in Palestine, Iraqi Kurdistan, Colombia, the Aegean Migrant Solidarity Network on Lesbos Island in Greece, and Turtle Island Solidarity Network in Canada and the US. The land where Jesus walked 2,000 years ago was occupied by the Roman Empire. And this is part of what Tom has shared with us. Today, Israel occupies Palestinian land and oppresses Palestinian people. Israel is expanding occupation of Palestinian land through the years, as you can see in the shrinking green on this map. For 25 years, CPT has been based in Old City Hebron, a city with ancient biblical roots. Over 200,000 Palestinians live in Hebron, while fewer than 1,000 Israeli settlers live here. Israeli military checkpoints have been established throughout Old City Hebron to restrict Palestinian movement and protect settler movement and illegal occupation. These two checkpoints here are two different kinds of checkpoints you'll see in different places. These restrict or control Palestinian entry to their main mosque in the Old City. Many Palestinian children also have to navigate checkpoints just to go to school every day. Israeli military guards randomly force children to wait at locked turnstiles, endure backpack searches, and subject children to tear gas or arrest. Palestinian children join the struggle by going to school to learn and as an act of resistance. CPT monitors various checkpoints and documents soldier and settler violence against Palestinians. Here are two different checkpoints. Soldiers arrested two boys at a checkpoint and marched them off to the police station. They were about 10 years old. That on the left, and on the right, soldiers threw tear gas down the street outside a kindergarten school. You see the tear gas hanging in the air there, and that happened just after the children had arrived in a bus and had filed into the school. Israeli soldiers roamed the Hebron marketplace, disrupting Palestinian lives and livelihood. When the soldiers are out, CPT is out monitoring their abusive violence. Here, a peaceful Palestinian march was abruptly disrupted by these soldiers. And we hurried up the team. We had 14 members out here with the soldiers that day, and we hurried up the marketplace street following the soldiers. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw these vegetables knocked off the cart on the ground there. And it took quick, hurrying on, I just turned, took a quick picture and went on and didn't realize until later that this Israeli soldier with his assault rifle was in it. It is a reminder that weapons of domination and death destroy life and livelihood. Yet Palestinians are committed to go on with daily life in their struggle for freedom. So with that very brief view of one biblical land, Palestine, we go to another biblical land, Iraq. September 11, 2001 gave the Bush administration an excuse to invade Iraq, even though Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. 15 CPTers, including me, were in Baghdad in March of 2003 when the US invaded Iraq. A story way too long to tell here. Part of it's told, that has to do with my part of it, in the Gospel of Ritba, War, Peace, and the Good Samaritan story in Iraq. The US claimed to only bomb military targets. CPT investigated and documented bombings of civilian targets in Baghdad. Here in this marketplace, in the second-story homes above the shops, here a young pregnant woman was killed in the bombing of these shops and homes. A couple of years later, in consultation with Iraqi partners, CPT departed or withdrew from Baghdad in mid-2006. Later that year, CPT was invited to the Kurdistan region of the northern Iraq. The CPT Iraqi Kurdistan team has been based in Suleimani since 2006. They're on the right center, and that colored area is all the Iraqi Kurdistan region. Iraqi Kurdistan is surrounded by Syria on the west, Turkey on the north, Iran on the east, and the rest of Iraq to the south. The CPT Iraqi Kurdistan team includes 3 Kurdish team members and members from Australia, the Czech Republic, Colombia, the US, and sometimes from Sweden. A primary CPT role is with people targeted by Turkey's cross-border bombardment. War on innocent civilians is waged in the name of the war on terror, a war on terror defined by the US. In this occasion, Turkish warplanes had bombed around the village of Zuka, which is way up on the mountainside there, 24 times in less than 24 hours. And so in the morning, all 20 families fled down the mountain where they found temporary shelter in tents by a river. CPT went to meet the courageous Zuka villagers. Village matriarch Per Aish, by the way, Per means auntie. She was an amazing person. She invited us into her tent with genuine Kurdish hospitality. And as we drank tea, Per Aish quietly told us about her village being bombed and forced to flee. And she said to us, we face an impossible situation, being bombed or being flooded. If we return to our village, they will bomb us. If we stay here, we'll soon be flooded by the fall rains that are already beginning. Per Aish spoke firmly of her and her village's determination to care for one another. The children of Zuka went to school in 2 tents, like this one, this is one of them, on the rocky shore of the river. These children refused to let war keep them from learning. When the rainy season arrived, these villagers unfortunately dispersed to live in nearby villages and cities. They are among the 79.5 million people displaced by warring violence in the world. Villages of the Nala Valley are frequently bombarded by Turkish warplanes and drones. CPT works with Muslim and Christian villages in the Nala Valley. We took a World Council of Churches and Churches for Middle East Peace delegation to meet our partners here. People from 7 Muslim and Christian villages talked with our delegation about living with the threat of bombing. Their desire is to live in peace with each other without being terrorized by war. In the village of Chamirabaki, this woman showed us a fragment of a Turkish missile that had hit the hillside above the village, which would be, you can just see in the far background, the bottom of the hillside there. We built partnerships with many village leaders who are usually men, but we also find ways to build partnerships with women who are the real truth tellers. This amazing woman, Aklima, is our partner in the village of Dupre. She is a bold woman who speaks bluntly about the terror of war and political corruption. Aklima told us one time that she is not worried for herself. She's lived a long life. So if she gets killed by a bomb or a bullet, it is nothing. But she's very concerned for their children growing up traumatized by war. Kurdish independent journalists facing political oppression are also CPT partners. We met with journalist Shirwan Shirwani, sitting at the far end on the right in the brown shirt, in his home. He was arrested and imprisoned for 42 days last year. And then this was after he was released. We were meeting with him. These are our CPT teammates here on the left. On October 7 of this year, a group of men, about 10 men, burst into his home and abducted him in front of his wife and children. He is now being held indefinitely in solitary confinement. Niaz Abdullah is another courageous independent journalist. She's in the black with the red and white there in the middle on the right. She too has been threatened many times and arrested. Niaz and Shirwan risk their lives speaking truth to power with amazing grace and courage. Our team was in this village when Turkish warplanes bombed the next village, another long story. People here face warring madness in the 21st century as others did in the first century. Kurds and Palestinians that I've come to know embody a spirit of hospitality, humility, and honesty. While imperial powers wage war with hubris, inflicting horror and hell on innocent people. With the global war on terror, the US wages endless war. This is something, I want you to remember this. This is how I've come to say, war we can't win, can't lose, can't stay, can't leave. The very definition of permanent warfare, perpetual war. The consequences of endless war in Iraq include first, death, injury, trauma, terror for countless people, plus destruction, dysfunction, and corruption. Second, the rise of ISIS in Iraq, where there were no terrorists. Third, Iran's growing influence in Iraq, where they were longtime enemies. Fourth, the toll on religious communities in Iraq, including increased intra-Islamic tensions. Another religious group, Yazidis, over 200,000 were displaced by ISIS in 2014. I was with the CPT-IK team in September, October 2014 at the height of ISIS crisis as we were documenting women and girls missing during that time. When the US invaded Iraq in 2003, there were still 1.5 million Christians. Today, there are about 150,000 Christians in this ancient biblical land. Well, friends, there is so much more to share about the places and people you've just encountered. I hope this gives you a sense of their strength and commitment to undoing oppression and waging peace rather than war. CPT welcomes your partnership for peace in the way of, with Jesus, opposing the way of war. You are invited to pray without ceasing, participate in, follow CPT on social media and email and newsletters and so on. Participate in CPT actions. Ask CPT to do a training for your faith community. Make a financial contribution to CPT. I had to get that in, but we're primarily funded by people like you. And become what you pray. I also send an occasional newsletter message called Voices and Views from Iraqi Kurdistan or Palestine or wherever I am. If you'd like to be on the mailing list, my email is there on the side. But I want to end on a personal note. Our granddaughter, Olivia, 10, for all the years that I've been going to CPT in the Middle East, she always draws, writes, creates something for Grandpa to take along to CPT. Last winter, Olivia came to me when she was with us overnight one time and said, just so solemnly and quietly, she said, Grandpa, Einstein said, the world is not destroyed by evil. The world is destroyed by those who watch and do nothing. And then she went and drew this for me to take along the next time I return to Iraqi Kurdistan. What I have come to know is that Jesus is God's truth, war is empire's lie. War is the myth of redemptive violence, nationalized, globalized, imperialized. A century ago, 90% of deaths in war were soldiers. Today, it's exactly reversed. 90% of war deaths are civilian, many of them children. War is war on children. Jesus welcomed and blessed children, warning, unless you become like children, you will not enter God's reign. God's love and my love for our children and grandchildren compels me to devote my life to the way, the truth, the life with Jesus Christ for the sake of all God's children. Thank you, peaceful friends, for listening and participating. Let me go stop sharing a lot of this and then Tom, okay, I'll be back. I want to go to you and begin sort of have you help connect Jesus, the Messiah of peace in the first century, now in the 21st century, and we can go from there a bit and then draw others into it.
Well, I'll first ask you a leading question, which is, what implications do you see from the story of the Messiah of Peace for CPT and for peacemaking in the 21st century?
Well, there are a couple of things I could say here, and I'd start, I guess, by connecting it with, you're talking about all nations, Jesus and care for the enemy and the prayer for all nations and so on. What I think we are learning is that none of us can do this on our own or alone, and that it is the building of relationships, of partnerships, of collaboration, of solidarity. The heart of Jesus was and is embracing and engaging the other, And note again, not nearly all CPTers are Christian or explicitly so. We have a lot of Muslims and others on teams. And so that's how we become multi-faith. But what we know is that we have to do this and work at this together. And working, especially with people who are marginalized, targeted, harmed, disempowered. But we learn and grow and heal with and from each other in collaboration with each other. I'm reminded of Lila Watson, an Aboriginal artist and activist, who said, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have become because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Jesus said it any better. That's part of what, there are many other things I can talk about this, but now you, let's hear from you, Tom.
Well, what strikes me is the connection between the stories of the Messiah of Peace and CPT's commitment to nonviolence and to nonviolent intervention.
For sure.
So this work of being present, I know that part of your of CPT's definition for a time was getting in the way of war, and there's, I think, profound congruence between that and what Jesus was doing, was getting in the way of warfare and conflict between peoples who were divided by geography, by ethnic identity, by politics. One of the things that is most, I think, striking about the Jesus movement was that Rome was an extraordinarily oppressive government that believed and celebrated the myth of redemptive violence every day in the Colosseum. So the slaughter of those who were defined as Rome's enemies was a sign of the greatness and the goodness of Rome. And so it was over against that oppressed people identified with Jesus and then carried out actions of loving kindness that were first in relation to slaves, people who were oppressed by the Roman Empire, but also by reaching out and making friends with those on the other side of the boundaries. One of the things that strikes me is that we have not taken seriously as both biblical scholars and as Christians, Jesus as a model and a leader for nonviolent intervention. In effect, often Christianity has allied itself with actions of warfare and of conflict. I remember a modest proposal for peace that Christians would not kill each other, and as a step toward peacemaking. So what strikes me is that there is more congruence between what CPT is doing than is the case with many churches who focus largely on personal salvation and are not engaged in relation to both the conflicts within our various countries, but also between then these groups, and this blind confidence that war will deliver us, that war is good. So that becomes a theme of American foreign policy.
Yeah, let me pick up on two themes there. One contemporary and maybe one biblical, Tom. In the contemporary sense, yes, CPT started out with getting in the way of war. We we've learned a great deal over the past 35 years. That getting in the way of war very readily, easily became sort of white Christian, particularly American savior complex, Messiah complex coming to solve things, get in the way of war. That's, we no longer use that, because that's why the mantra is building partnerships to transform violence and oppression. It's solidarity, it's being with, it's listening to, it's taking the lead from those we're with. What I would say that I have found is in this, it's probably the most inspiring. People know what they need in all these places, far more than we ever will. Being with them in it, in that solidarity, is what becomes so profoundly important, so that they know they're not abandoned. The world cares, and there are many, many stories on that.
Right.
I would add the one other connection for me, I go to Luke's gospel mostly, and just a couple of things from there and the gospel prologue is, so the purpose of the gospel is so that you may know the truth. We live in pretty much a post-truth time, so that you may know the truth concerning things about which you've been instructed. Then we have quickly unfolding on Mary's giving of herself to embody Jesus in the Magnificat, which turns the world upside down, but it is not turning it upside down in the sense of the people on the bottom now get to be the people on the top and harming the people on the bottom. It's changing the whole paradigm, the whole system of oppression, of the domination system. And then, of course, there's Jesus' inaugural sermon, the proclamation of Isaiah 42, that's in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus begins ministry. But what struck me and what I use a lot when I do presentations in churches is the journey narrative, Luke 9-19. Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem, taking disciples with him to the heart of empire, that imperial regional place of religious, political, military domination. He knows that's where you have to go, to where there's harm being done. And it's that whole journey. Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem, and then he arrives and he weeps over Jerusalem, the city whose name means peace, salam, shalom, and weeps over Jerusalem. Would that you knew the things that make for peace. Now they are hidden from your hearts. For me, that's a gospel paradigm that informs the lived narrative today. So maybe,
and I'd add to that,
yes,
in relation to the themes from that emerge from Mark, that Luke has in the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus says, love your enemies, pray for those who hate you, do good
yes,
for your enemies. And at the end of this sermon in 4, he cites Elijah and Elisha as those who did cross boundaries. So they are the ones who serve as precedents for him. And I'm thinking about that in relation to also the 21st century. Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. both took Jesus very seriously in relation to a strategy of nonviolent resistance to oppression, and have established the viability of nonviolent resistance in a way that has not been the case throughout most of Western history. So there is then, I think, real importance in that, and that meditating on, thinking about the stories from the Gospels is something that I think we could all do well to take more seriously, to learn from those strategies, which is what happened with Martin Luther King. There is, I think, a lot that we have to learn as human beings about ways that make for peace, with a focus on peacemaking as a central dimension of what God is seeking for the human community, all of whom are not enemies, but rather we're all common human beings who are part of then this global government of the kingdom of God. So,
Yes. We are all in it together. I think Barbara Deming was the one who said that. I'm sure many others have. We are all in this together, and either it will, the world will be healed, saved, if you will, including everyone, or it'll all be destroyed. There is no such thing as my security depends on harming, destroying you. You're at fault. So that's the myth of redemptive violence. That you're at fault. In order for us to be safe or secure, we have to destroy you. Then that's the great lie.
yeah. Yes. Yeah, it's clear. I think, you know, part of what this story tells against is the story of the myth of redemptive violence, and that we need to set those, because of the degree to which these stories have paradigmatic impact on foreign policy, on the way in which people think about how to resolve conflicts, and that both to learn and to meditate on these stories is from the Gospels is a way forward for the human community. That both people who are searching for ways of making peace, but they need to take seriously what is revealed, what is made clear in these stories in the Gospels.
If I could jump in, Tom.
Yes, please.
That's actually a perfect segue, because there have been a number of questions that have come through the chat and the Q&A box. And just to remind people, you can put your questions in the Q&A box. That's the easiest way for us to look at them. But I would just like to highlight a couple that have come through that are about sort of like digging into some challenging texts where it's not so like, where it's sort of a question of interpretation. Is Jesus being violent, or is this characterizable as nonviolent? So two different texts were mentioned in the questions. One is the turning over of the tables in the temple, and the other is Jesus's encounter with the Syrophoenician woman when he calls her a dog. So I'm wondering if, especially Tom, but both of you could speak to those texts, like kind of, I know Tom has already made a case that the turning over the tables should be understood as a nonviolent action. So like, maybe kind of drive, unpack that for us a little bit, Tom, because everybody on the chat is not convinced. And what about this troubling conversation with the Syrophoenician woman? And the question that's underneath that is, are we sort of, is making Jesus into an ideal really the answer? Like, do we run, is there a risk that raises? Or this is my attempt to summarize the question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, in relation to the so-called cleansing of the temple, this demonstration that Jesus did, what's clear in the story is that it was not seen as a violent attack. They didn't bring out the guards. What happened undoubtedly was that after Jesus left, they put their tables back and resumed business as usual. That it was a symbolic demonstration, and that no one was hurt. There is no evidence that it was seen as a threat to civil unrest. The problem that the chief priests and the scribes had with it, which is named afterwards, is that people were enthusiastic about the demonstration and about the policy that it implied of creating and defending a place of prayer where Gentiles and Jews could pray together. And that's what is emphasized in the story. so that both the historical analysis of what may have happened, that is, that whatever took place in Jesus' action, nobody was hurt, that there were no actions of arresting him. He was he came into the temple the next day and taught all day long. So I think it is not I don't know, accurate to describe it as a violent action. In relation to the Syrophoenician woman, the story reflects the norms of Israelites, that those on the other side, those who were Syrophoenicians, were associated with the wholesale murder of Jewish children by the Syrians. And so for Jesus to even have any contact with a Syrophoenician woman was to erase his credibility as a Jew. So for him to call her a dog was simply to name the reality of their relationships. But what he does is to establish dialogue. And when the woman then responds with, yes, but even the dogs eat the children's crumbs, he is moved and recognizes that she's not speaking out of a place of arrogance or of assertion of Syrian rights to healing because they were somehow more powerful. Rather, he responds with compassion. And that in turn is an action of nonviolent protest against the way in which the relationships between Jews and Syrians, Phoenicians, had become battlegrounds rather than places of reconciliation. So he does, in the end, then carry out an action that is politically realistic, and her daughter is healed. So it's a revolutionary action that he does in the context of the audiences who were hearing this story, I think.
Thank you.
Can I respond to that?
Please.
Yeah, in terms of today, and two things or several things come to my mind. There's so much in that. The first is we'd have to do a lot of unpacking of what we mean by violence. And that's where there's a lot of confusion today, which usually means we do more violence. And the simple way of saying it, which I found very true, is silence is violence. There are no bystanders. You have to make a choice. We're either choosing God or empire. We're participating in the system one way or another. And that in the activism today, what we draw from Jesus and the whole journey to Jerusalem in Luke's gospel speaks to me of a spirituality of resistance, of going to the heart of things, of both symbolically and actually, literally in ways. And when in that kind of explicit resistance to domination systems of evil, there has to be some kinds of dismantling that will often be accused of being violent. Dismantling oppressions, dismantling racism, dismantling warfare and militarism is not going to be a simple or easy thing. That's the kind of spirituality that we have to have and learn how to be present for, and that there are significant differences between between people and property and when violence happens. And those are all things that are nuanced or have to have attention. But we have a lot of work to do on that here in our country and context as well. So I just wanted to add that one too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
So There's a couple other key questions I want to make sure we get out before we start to wrap up. And by the way, there are way too many questions for us to answer all of them before we turn into pumpkins at 9 p.m. So, but we will make an attempt to address the ones we don't get to in an email, in a follow-up email. So thank you so much to everybody who's posted questions, and please don't hold back if you have more. But so there's two additional questions that I want to draw out from the chats that have come up, and I'm just going to say them both before I turn it over to you guys to answer. One is a pretty important political question. Knowing the relationship between money and warfare, what do you think of BDS? And then, so that's the first question.
What?
Knowing the relationship between money and warfare, what do you think of BDS, which is the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement? And then there's a number of questions that have come in about reflecting on privilege. I'm going to try to summarize them. As US citizens, what have you had to unlearn and learn when it comes to oppression and white privilege in this work? I know Weldon started to talk about that, but maybe you could just address it a little more directly. And also regarding biblical scholarship, what is the responsibility of white male biblical scholars and teachers in our current white dominated and patriarchal context? Sorry, those are kind of doozies, but I know you guys have already started to get at them. So who wants to go first?
Now, what was the first one again, Amy?
That is the question about boycott, divestment. And
yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Weldon.
Well, let me just address that one a little bit because that's such a big conversation. There are many forms of nonviolence. Gene Sharp, who I first met in the mid-1970s, categorized 198 forms. Now there are more than that, including boycotts and divestments. And that was what was done in South Africa, South African apartheid, that helped dismantle that. I think it's essential to see it in those terms around Palestinians. For anyone who spends any time with Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza, knows the extent of the oppression and domination that has to be attended to. And BDS is one significant organized way to do that. The tragedy is not BDS. The tragedy is the opposite, because there is a concerted effort in this country to criminalize BDS. That not only is, in my view, will be extremely destructive and unfortunate if that actually happens, but that begins to undermine democracy and freedom of speech and action. We will become more militarized, not less, and people in power will see more and more the same thing here. So that's a very short take on that one. I do support BDS.
And I do too. I've been part of efforts on the part of the United Methodist Church to boycott American companies that have been profiting from the occupation in the West Bank. And that seems to me to be a wholly legitimate form of nonviolent resistance.
Yes.
And so the demonization of that is an effort to make marginal then any efforts to redress the balance of justice in relation to what is happening and our involvement as Americans in supporting an oppressive regime, which is, and a major dimension of that I would name is that there are another part of the boycott is that it provides support for the resistance movements within the state of Israel itself. There are active movements to explore ways of peacemaking, to cross the boundaries that in turn get criminalized. But those are actions that need to be supported, encouraged, and developed. And there are movements within the community of Israelites of Israelis for whom that's the case. And so we provide support for that. And I think that's part of the reality of politics. And so I'm in favor of PBS, I guess.
Yeah, there were some other questions Amy had.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for that answer. And I'm sorry I tried to squinch the two together.
Yeah,
They're not the
there's
same.
so much there.
I didn't want to. I didn't want to get by. They were two both really important questions. The other question is about white privilege, especially white male privilege, and U.S. citizen privilege in this work. How do we make sense of it, and how is that related to these biblical calls to cross over to the other side and stand with folks that don't have those privileges?
That's very, very important, and we're very aware in CPT. So I can only speak personally out of this. I'm very, very aware wherever I am in any of these situations that I'm a mid-70s white American Christian professional pastor. I have all the privileges. So I've been, particularly in CPT, I try to be extremely sensitive and aware, present, because I think presence is so important. But my hope, you'd have to ask my teammates whether I succeed at that, is to be, I branded presence without coming across as I can use all of my privileges to solve your problems, which is participate in the line of war, is the way I would say it.
Yep.
Domination, be part of the domination system. So we all have to face that. I think it's in this country, it's the great learning, and so much of the enormous conflicted energy is trying to reinforce white male Christian supremacy, put everything back in the box again and make it work like it did. And that one, that's
out of the box.
It's out of the box and it's very violent.
Right. Yep. Well, you asked Amy in relation to white male scholars in the present patriarchal context. My sense is it's essentially twofold. One is that that part of the role of white male scholars is to sponsor and enable people who have been excluded from access to positions, to leadership, to scholarship, and is to support that, to form new communities that cut across those boundaries that have been present. And that is an extraordinarily creative process that I've seen develop over the course of my life. At the time when I started at Union in New York in 1962, there was one woman on the faculty in Christian education. That has been transformed in my lifetime. And I think Union is a stronger place. There were also no African Americans in the PhD program at that time. That too, Union now, as a result of some of the protests that happened by graduate students. Union now has graduated more African-American PhDs than any institution in the country. With the possible exception in terms of the Doctor of Ministry program of United Theological Seminary in Dayton, which has hundreds of African-American graduates with Doctor of Ministry, who were led by Samuel DeWitt Proctor and the Proctor Fellows. That is an ongoing process. But I think it's also the case that white male scholars have a contribution to make, and that it is important for them not to be, I don't know, excluded from participation as part of the academic community. So I think what we are developing is healthy, which is a collaboration that is a combination of the strengths of the various constituencies from which we come and that we represent.
Thank you both. So we're going to try to wrap up in about 10 minutes, but I want to put another doozy on the table before we finish. There's been a couple of questions, as would I'm sure come as no surprise to you, about what should we do? What should we do about this? And let me just read one of them in particular. What do each of you think are the sources in American culture that foster the redemption of violence in right-wing Christian evangelical movement, especially, and alternatively, what are the cultural sources that foster an embrace of nonviolence? And to put it how somebody else put it, like, how can we, organize to draw out that the latter? Yeah, let's. Do you guys? I mean, I know that. Weldon talked about how important it is to get involved with and to support the work of CPT. And let's not forget how important that simple answers can be. The group's doing good work. We got to unite with that and support. And so if anybody on this call is not already connected with CPT, please follow those links and link up. But what else can we do, Weldon and Tom, to work against this culture of redemptive violence in our society?
Well, I think one of the things that we can do is to learn and tell the stories of the Gospels as counter stories to the myth of redemptive violence. One of the things that happens is that I find that people are very timid about telling the stories and giving them a context in relation to this lie that we will be redeemed by violence. And that only gets countered by people telling another story. And so I think it is of extreme importance that we learn, explore, do research, and learn and tell these stories. It is a dimension of the transformation of society that is often not recognized, is the importance of those stories. But the myth of redemptive violence gets reinforced every day by the war games that children are taught to play, by the constant replaying of films of superheroes redeeming people by extreme violence. So those stories get told all the time, and people make millions of dollars on selling those stories. So the recognition of the importance of there being a counter story that is told, I think, needs to be emphasized.
I'd add a couple of things to that, Tom. One was CPT. One of the things I always emphasize, certainly we welcome your participating and so on. But as I share about our building partnerships to transform violence and oppression, and we're doing that where we have teams that are on the ground, but it's also very, very important to know that, that there are many ways to be involved in CPT, and that you are partners at home, building partnerships at home. That's why we have events like this, or I often speak mostly in churches and so on, because people need to know that not everyone is called to be on a team or to do this, but we can't do it without you. Everyone can participate by supporting it and contributing to it and praying and so on. The other thing, though, is there are so many amazing people and groups now going on around the country working at this. There's a whole new collaboration and consortium of peace groups that are available. There are probably people in your own community and groups to be involved in. Lots of groups for sort of undoing oppressions and the anti-racism work and anti-militarism. And so I'd really encourage you to think and explore what's happening in your neighborhood, who's your own community, your own city, who's doing it, what's there, how you can participate in that, as well as with national, international groups, and be a part of more than one thing, and keep learning and trying to relate it to your own life and how you're involved in it and what you need to unlearn. And so on. So yeah, I guess that's where I'll leave it for now.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And it's a perfect transition for me to just remind people of the series that this is a part of. Actually, Tom's vision for having this dialogue with Weldon, which you just witnessed, was the spark for this whole series that we've put together at the Center and Library for the Bible and Social Justice, which we're calling Scholar Activist Encounters. And some of you have been joining for a while. Some of you, this is the first one you've been on, but we're going to be continuing to do it every third Thursday. So the next one will be on January 21st. And that one is really exciting. It's going to feature our board chair, Nicholas Johnson, who gave the opening prayer. I think he's probably still here. And Reverend Dr. Don Hyung Jong from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. And that should be a really wonderful encounter. I'm going to paste the, hang on a sec, let's see if I can do this, into the chat, the posting about that contains more information on Nick's work and Don Hyung's work. And please check it out and register. And this is a journey that we're on together. This is an epistemological journey of asking, how can we learn not just from scholarship, but also from the activist work and the culture transforming work that we're all a part of? And then how can we bring it together? And so over time, step by step, we will hopefully get to those bigger questions, find the answers to those bigger questions that some of those folks asked in the Q&A and that we didn't quite answer, but we're working on it. So thanks everybody for being with us this evening. People are asking, how can I get in touch with folks if my question didn't get addressed? And we will make sure that the questions that didn't get addressed get directed to Weldon and Tom, and we'll send y'all a follow-up email soon with that information. So thank you everybody so much. We're gonna close with a song. Let me just pull it up here. This is from a group called Voices Together. So nice. A Mennonite singing group. That's one of the living traditions that influences us, animates our work on this call. So let's allow them to pray us out. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for participating.
We prophet and speak. see my tempest